a dogma lesson, just not bothering to plan? That's a question for TEFLologists. When I read this book, is it better to skim or scan? That's a question for TEFLologists. Can you be a good teacher if you have a CELTA? Or should you invest in an MA or a Delta? From politics to methodology, we'll discuss them all on TEFLology.
Hi, I'm Matthew.
I'm Rob.
I'm Matt.
And I'm Richard.
And welcome back to TEFLology, a podcast about teaching English as a foreign language and related matters, presented this week by 4 self-certified TEFLologists.
TEFL Cultures. For today's TEFL Culture section, we have a special guest TEFLologist, Richard. Richard is an enthusiast in the field of authenticity, and he's going to be talking about that today. So, take it away.
Thanks very much. Okay. So, I'm going to talk about authenticity in language teaching, especially authenticity in English language teaching. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a sort of special position of English in the kind of authenticity debate, which is one of the reasons why it's a bit of a thorny issue. Mm-hmm. So to start off, I wondered what you guys understand by the term authenticity.
I understand nothing by the way. I mean, in terms of English language teaching, I don't know.
Do you mean authenticity in the classroom?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I can think of authentic materials, for example.
Mm-hmm.
I can think of authentic communication.
Mm-hmm.
That's what perhaps I would understand by authenticity in English teaching.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Maybe authentic tasks,
right.
Authentic language. I mean, kind of things that reflect the real world,
right?
I guess, in the classroom.
Yeah, and I think that when people talk about authenticity, when they're talking about language teaching, they often come down to materials mainly. Yeah. So, what's your image of an authentic material?
Maybe, for example, a leaflet. Mm-hmm. So, say the students were studying about train timetables or something to do with a station. They might have a schedule of the trains, maybe.
I hate that word, realia.
Realia.
So basically, something that's not designed for students, something that's designed for language users in the real world, which is then imported into the classroom.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's quite the very common definition of authentic materials. And if you look up authenticity in the Longman Dictionary of Applied Linguistics, which I have a well-thumbed copy of, it sort of states that it's materials not designed for the purpose of language teaching originally, but something that comes from the target language culture mainly.
Okay.
So, do you guys think there might be any problems with that definition?
Well, as we were saying before, there's maybe you can talk about authenticity in terms of other areas like authentic tasks, authentic communication, not just in terms of materials. But I guess there's a question over what counts as authentic as well. Yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I imagine there are certain materials that might kind of be on the border between are they really authentic or not.
Yeah.
I guess maybe certain different materials, they have certain pragmatics behind. So, like, for example, a train timetable was designed for one purpose, essentially. It wasn't designed for learning, maybe. That might be the problem.
Right.
Possibly.
Yeah, and I think that one of the issues with authenticity is that it often is sort of defined as coming from a particular culture. So one of the reasons why people had this huge kind of debate over what is authentic around the kind of 70s and 80s when communicative language teaching was really kind of taking off, is that people weren't comfortable with the idea that authenticity could be from one particular culture.
Right.
So what's your idea of like an authentic task?
Over to you, Mr. Tasks.
Authentic task. Well, I guess something that takes place outside of the classroom, normally, like a shopkeeper. That sounds quite archaic. Shopkeeper. Someone who works in a shop, and maybe one of the students comes into the shop and asks about a product. That, for me, that's quite authentic.
Right.
Maybe.
So something that involves like real life interaction with other people, essentially. Yeah, to accomplish the kind of task or the kind of thing that you would be doing in normal life.
Yeah, I'd say. Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder.
Is
I mean,
authentic?
I guess that could be authentic. Maybe it comes back to students' needs. If you send a student to go to the shop to buy some bread, that's their task. Maybe they don't eat bread. I don't know. Then you start to reduce the authenticity, possibly.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of similar to what Kanagaraja talks about in one of his books. He says he describes the Sri Lankan classroom where they can, they're sitting there in this kind of war-torn area. They can hear bombs exploding and people shouting, and they're worried about their families and things like that, and they're reading textbooks about John and Mary going to the nightclub, for them that's not an authentic thing. It's not relevant to their lives. Is that the kind of thing that you're talking about?
Yeah, so Henry Widdowson kind of talks about this quite a lot in nearly every one of his books actually talks about authenticity to some extent, and he was sort of saying that what's authentic for one group of people will not be authentic for another,
right?
And because there are so many differences. So, exactly like your example there, if you want to learn English to go out to nightclubs, then of course that's going to be an authentic text. But if you've got other concerns, then that's not really very authentic for you. So originally the authenticity definition were defined kind of according to native speakers, in fact. And Alex Gilmore wrote a paper in 2007 where he kind of identifies 8 different definitions of authenticity, which I should kind of know by heart, but he first started off with the native speaker definition and then moved on to people who define it according to real language for real purposes.
Right. Okay.
But there's also a definition relating to self. You personally find it authentic. You by how you perceive it, or it could be the classroom, and that's kind of based on tasks.
Yeah. Yep.
There's also a social aspect, and there's an even one aspect that only relates to assessments, and then there's a kind of cultural one where maybe you're an immigrant and you want to be validated by the culture that you're going to live amongst, so you want to be seen as one of the speakers there.
I guess a lot of these connect as well. I mean, there's a lot of intertwining between them.
He actually calls them his interrelated definitions.
Okay.
So there is a lot of overlap on that. But I mean, the thing is that I think that authenticity, it's one of those words that people use all the time in staff rooms, and it's used to sell textbooks. But if you kind of ask people exactly what it is, then they quickly get into the boggy ground of trying to define it. So that's one of the things that I've been quite interested in. But the main reason that I'm interested in authenticity is because it's used as it collocates with motivation. So people are often interested in authenticity because they believe using authentic materials will somehow connect to motivation.
Right.
So, can you explain that a little bit?
Well, I wish I could.
Right.
But yeah,
I mean, the idea that more authentic materials would be more motivating for students?
Exactly that, yeah. So the more authentic it is, the more motivating it is. But obviously there are some of the problems might be that if your definition of authenticity is the kind of classic definition of, say, a newspaper or something that hasn't been changed for the learners, it's quite high level, and you can't just take a newspaper into an elementary class. And another problem is how you use the material, and then the other problem is, like you said with Kanagaraja's example in Sri Lanka, that it might not even be relevant or authentic even when you do that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting whether authentic materials are more motivating. I mean, I find that, for example, like graded readers, are much more motivating than trying to read an actual book because I can't understand the book, and failure is very demotivating.
Yeah. Although, I mean, I would say what's very motivating for me, for example, learning Japanese is, on the train, reading the ads on the, all those kind of things. It reminded me of, I remember a talk by Thornbury where he uses an authentic, like the back of a box of tea and the little blurb written on that, and he kind of deconstructs that, and I think ran through corpus analysis and all kinds of stuff, and just kind of showed what you could pull out of that.
Yeah.
So I learned probably most of the kanji I've learned, the Chinese characters for Japanese, I learned on the train, like looking at station names and looking at ads. And
station names are really useful.
Also, like are you familiar with like dogme ELT?
Yeah.
That kind of seems like it could be authentic because I think I heard. I think it was Luke Meddings, one of the.
Yeah.
He basically said if the students are already talking about a topic when the class starts, to go with that topic that's of relevance to the students at the time, and build something lessony around what's taking place in the class.
I would totally agree with that. Actually, I think that's great, and so various. Because when you sort of talk about authenticity, it gets quite abstract. So various people have tried to make it more, how can it be actually relevant in a usable way? So I think that Frida Mishan talks about currency, and that doesn't mean money, but it means things that are relevant at that time. So I think Medding's idea is really connected, and you should just kind of go with the flow, really, and what's ever interesting to your students or what's going to be relevant to them, that's going to be authentic, and it shouldn't really matter whether or not it's not an inherent linguistic property, or it doesn't matter if you've adapted it or if it's a graded reader.
Right.
Anything can be authentic as long as it's actually something that's going to generate interest, and that's why it can be motivating to use authentic materials.
It's a nice take-home lesson for the teachers listening. Yeah. So that's today's TEFL culture.
TEFL Pioneers.
Okay, this week's TEFL Pioneer is a man.
As usual.
Yep.
So far.
Yeah, so far. Yeah, we'll try to address that in future episodes. I guess maybe our youngest TEFL pioneer, born in 1941.
Okay.
Stephen Krashen, I'm sure everybody's at least somewhat familiar with.
Yeah, we've mentioned him before.
I'm sure we've mentioned him before. I guess maybe a little bit, not disregarded, but I guess, his most famous contribution to TEFL, the input hypothesis, is maybe considered, maybe other hypotheses have surpassed that.
Yeah.
And for that reason, maybe he's somewhat overlooked. But I think maybe still has contributed enough to the field to be considered a pioneer.
One of my old MA tutors said that he was the only applied linguist who needed an agent. He was so famous when he was...
back in the day.
day.
Right. Yeah. So I guess maybe in the 70s, mid 70s to 80s was his day, his heyday. And I don't, to be honest, I don't have much bio data on him. The fact that he was born in 1941. Yeah. He's originally from Chicago, and he's currently professor emeritus at the University of Southern California.
Right.
A few things we can talk about, but maybe starting with the input hypothesis, which was considered one of 5 hypotheses that he came up with. I think now maybe the input hypothesis or the monitor model is the umbrella term for these 5 hypotheses. So the first being the input hypothesis, this idea that all that's needed for language acquisition is input.
Right.
Comprehensible input, and this idea of the I plus 1.
What's the I plus 1?
Basically, if the I is the level that a learner currently has, and plus 1 would be one step up from that.
Right.
And so the input that the learner, if the learner is only receiving input, which is at the level that they already have, that's not enough for new language acquisition. And obviously, if it's too high, if it's incomprehensible, then that's also not going to do anything. Like we were talking about reading, sitting down with a Japanese newspaper probably at our level isn't going to help us because there's too many unknown phrases.
So they say it's best to learn with someone who's slightly better than you, but not much better than you in a sense.
Yeah. So
if you're in a conversation, maybe with someone who's
or somebody who knows how to grade their language.
Someone who's
What's the second hypothesis?
The second hypothesis is the acquisition learning hypothesis, which is just this idea that there is a very clear separation or difference between acquisition and learning.
Right.
So he saw acquisition as just the subconscious process that would happen through large amounts of comprehensible input, whereas learning is the conscious process.
Right.
Kind of what maybe most people can consider what happens in a language classroom.
Like sitting and studying grammar or learning vocabulary lists.
Yeah, exactly. Learning it explicitly.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah.
The next is the monitor hypothesis. So he says that learned language, so this consciously learned language, can have its uses, but only to monitor language output.
Right.
However, if you are using your conscious knowledge of, for example, grammar rules, vocabulary, to monitor your language output, it probably means your output is going to be quite slow and unnatural.
Right.
If you're always trying to apply rules that you know.
Yeah, and we always encounter learners who are like that, who are really worried about making mistakes, so they're constantly stopping and rewording and going back and going very, very slowly.
Yeah,
that kind of thing.
exactly.
Yeah.
I think in the end or maybe now, I think his idea is that it's really only useful for writing.
Right.
In terms of output, for spoken output, it results in the kind of thing you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
The next is the natural order hypothesis, which is this idea that language items, I guess, are learned in a particular order, and that instruction doesn't change that order.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
For example, what?
For example, so maybe the most common example is the third-person singular S.
Right.
So, that's something that students, maybe in their first or second year of learning English, they're taught. So first you're taught I go, and then you go, and then he goes. And they're taught, you have to put this S, this third-person singular S.
Conditionals are also taught in the same way as well. Third condition.
Right,
is
those
considered
kind of things.
more difficult.
Yeah,
less frequent.
So the third-person singular S is considered a relatively easy one, and it is an easy rule to remember, but in terms of how often it appears in students' output, it appears much, much later.
Right.
Yeah. Isn't that considered one of the features of the lingua franca core as well? That people who are extremely proficient still drop it because, what's the point, really? When you think about it, what's the point?
Exactly. It has no semantic weight.
I've actually read a paper about how it's totally useless and that, it's a functional S.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And maybe conditionals.
Yeah, slightly different, I guess.
Slightly, maybe a bit more.
Because they have a separate function
semantic
for each.
weight. But it's amazing how often native speakers don't use this kind of strict conditional system that we've set up.
Mixed conditionals.
Yeah.
Right.
This idea of the natural order is interesting. There's a natural order for first language acquisition as well, and there's some overlap between the natural order of first language acquisition for English and second language, but they're not exactly the same.
Yeah. I was going to ask how much of his hypotheses are influenced by observations from first language acquisition, because it seems like they would apply more to that than to at least my experience of second language learning and second language teaching.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I think it is an hypothesis for second language acquisition, but I agree there does seem heavy influence from first language acquisition.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. What was the final one?
The final one is the effective filter hypothesis, which is an interesting one. It seems a little bit, quite different from the first four, and it's this idea of affect. So basically, students, if they're experiencing any negative emotions during the language acquisition process, it's going to limit how much language is acquired.
Right.
Yeah.
So one of those things would be motivation, for example.
Yeah, I'm sure it has a lot of connections to motivation. It's this. I think the kind of normal example is if a student becomes embarrassed in the classroom or scared or
experiences constant failure.
Yeah. So the way he describes it is as a filter. That embarrassment throws up a filter, and that the comprehensible input can't get through to the student, or it comes through, but they're not processing it in the necessary ways.
Right.
But I think connecting it to motivation might be an interesting way to view it as well.
Yeah. So he was very, very popular back in the sort of 70s, 80s when he was theorising this, when he was coming up with these ideas.
Yeah.
What happened after that? How did he fall from linguistic grace?
I think
I don't know if he has he?
Not completely. Yeah, I think things like the effective filter are kind of well recognized still and well thought of, and the acquisition learning difference is maybe still looked at. I think maybe the biggest thing was the input hypothesis.
Yeah.
So his idea that is the only thing you need for language acquisition.
Was it Swain who said you need output as well? That was this big challenge to Krashen.
Yes.
Not just input, you also need output. You need to be pushing out the language.
Right. Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and I think Swain maybe just as I don't know how serious it was, maybe it's really serious. Just had this output hypothesis, which is that's kind of all you need is output.
Yeah.
And then I guess it was maybe Long this idea of the interaction, which kind of makes sense. You need both. You need the input and the output. Yes. But I think a lot of things that he talked about maybe still apply. His theories did lead to a kind of approach called the natural approach, which he didn't. I think TEFL kind of came up with originally, but then adapted it to kind of fit Krashen's ideas.
Yeah.
What he spends a lot of time on talking about is extensive reading.
Yeah. Which we've talked about before.
Episode
2, listeners.
This idea of comprehensible input, and I wasn't there, but he gave a talk at an extensive reading conference where he was kind of pushing to change the term comprehensible input into compelling input.
Right.
So it also needs to be compelling. Just a final thing, maybe.
Does it need to be authentic input?
What's compelling? They're interested in it. You mean?
Yeah. So I think in that case, maybe compelling could be the same as authentic.
I think you mentioned before extensive reading. They make the argument kind of read anything, even if you're not interested in it. Read it. And were you saying compelling means choose something that you want to read?
Well, I think some extensive reading people would say that it should only be something that the learner wants to read.
Yeah, that's what was his name? The guy that we went to see.
Rob Waring.
Rob Waring, yeah.
Yes.
That's what he was
saying.
saying.
Expert in ER.
Yeah.
That's why I've never managed to get my head around a Japanese newspaper, because they tend to focus on business and I'm not very interested in it, so I don't invest much time trying to work it out because it's not interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so anyway, that's our TEFL Pioneer for this week.
TEFL News.
Today's TEFL news story is actually not really that concerned with TEFL. It's about foreign language teaching in the UK, and specifically the fact that from this academic year, primary school students have started learning languages. So there were some instances of primary school students learning languages before this. Not very many, mostly in kind of private schools and things like that. But from this year, it's being pushed in a more widespread way.
Okay. In state schools.
Yes, and then the number of languages that they're going to be learning has also increased quite a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So not just your standard French, German, Spanish, but also things like Mandarin, Arabic, and so on.
Oh, wow.
Just to give this a bit of context, what age is primary school in the
UK? So this is primary key stage 2, which is students aged from 7 to 11.
7 to 11. Okay.
Yeah, that's the age. So did you hear about this at all?
I knew that in Japan, English is now taught from primary school, and that was a big thing like 2 years ago. Or something. I didn't know in the UK.
Yeah, well, it's just started from this academic year, so just very recently. The reason or the rationale that they've used to justify this is the idea that the learning process is easier when you're a child, that your brain is more plastic, that it's more malleable, that it's easier to learn things as a child than as an adult. So they thought introducing foreign language instruction earlier might, improve the UK's fairly dismal record of language education.
Chomsky kind of.
The critical period that you were talking about before, weren't you?
Yeah. Well, I mean, what do you think about that? The idea of things like languages being easier to learn as a child.
I mean, that's a common perception.
Yeah.
I don't know how much research backs that up necessarily. But regardless of that, I think it's. I like the idea of students from 7 learning different foreign languages.
Yeah.
I can't see any downsides to it. Maybe some benefits.
Well, I mean,
Sorry, what's the reason they're giving for this? They just think it's easier.
Yeah, they think it's going to improve foreign language skills in British children.
Did they, at no point, do they mention maybe immigration of being a underlying reason for this?
That's not mentioned in the articles that I've read, but it could be. It could be
because you often hear these stories about schools, especially in the big cities in London, where there's 10 different languages being spoken.
Yeah, there was actually a recent report saying that there's 140 different languages being spoken in schools in the Black Country, which is around Birmingham and the West Midlands. 140 different languages. Pretty good. So it was, as I said, the reason or the rationale that they gave was that it's easier for children to learn languages. Now, coincidentally, I was recently reading the book Second Language Acquisition Myths.
Yeah.
Sorry, there's a motorbike revving outside the window. I'll try to edit that out. Thanks, bike.
Continue.
So recently I was reading the book Second Language Acquisition Myths, and they covered this topic, whether it is in fact easier to learn languages as a child. What they found is that actually research doesn't seem to support that.
Yeah.
It's easier to learn first languages. Sure. It's easier to learn second languages in an immersion environment, like natural L2 acquisition.
Yeah.
But in terms of instruction, it's actually, children don't show any great gains from learning at a younger age. In fact, adults sometimes perform slightly better because they have more cognitive strategies available to them to process the language and to learn the language and to think through it and and structure things.
Yeah, I mean, actually, the Krashen, the monitor hypothesis that we talked about using this learned language predicts that at least initial progress would be faster by adults than children.
Right.
I also think what Ellis talked about in the interview with a focus on form.
Yeah.
When you're an adult learner, maybe focus on form is very important.
Yeah.
But as a child, it's probably quite difficult to realise they're doing that, perhaps.
I think there's some good logic behind teaching, learning anything from an earlier age, but I think the Lenneberg's critical period hypothesis was about first language acquisition, and it hasn't really got that much evidence for second language acquisition. And in fact, I'm sure I read somewhere that in the study they did where parents and children kind of emigrated, the parents picked up the second language quicker because they are better speakers in the first language.
I see.
So I think it really applies mostly to bilinguals or first language.
Yeah. Another relevant point is the amount of instruction. So there's evidence among slightly older children in their early teens that if they're engaged in natural second language acquisition, so generally immigrants who are immersed in a language, then they're going to improve very, very quickly and reach a near native level relatively quickly. But as Thornbury points out in Big Questions in the LT, if there's only an hour's instruction a week, which is what this curriculum change would entail, it actually doesn't make much of a difference. It doesn't lead to any great gains.
Is it mentioned what languages they would be studying?
So as I mentioned, there's your basic European languages, French, Spanish, and so on. But they also have languages like Mandarin, Arabic. I think other ones were Urdu, perhaps also maybe more remote ones like Japanese or whatever.
I wonder how they would one school just pick one language, or could different students study different languages?
Probably depend on the teachers as well that they've got available.
Yeah, well, this is actually another couple of problems with the curriculum change is that the students can choose like quite a range of languages at elementary school, but most of these languages aren't supported by the secondary schools that they're feeding into.
Right.
So they can't continue their language study later on if they've chosen some of the more exotic languages. Another problem is that there aren't enough foreign language teachers.
Oh, really?
There are, for example, Mandarin and Arabic. There aren't
Yeah.
many people who are qualified to UK certified level
Yeah.
who are able to actually teach those languages.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's another problem. So what do you think overall about this this
Yeah.
curriculum change?
I mean, even if it's you get one student who gets interested in Mandarin out of 1,000 and goes on to, want to study it further later on, I think that's nice. Like I said before, I don't think it's a waste of time in the classroom.
Yeah.
Even if it's just kind of raising intercultural awareness or that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's one positive point about this, that it is raising awareness of other cultures. Perhaps they'll learn a few words. They may integrate some of these words into their
Sure.
vocabulary, perhaps.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's... How about authenticity? There might be any issues with young learners being given this language and not really knowing what to do with it.
Yeah, I think that's one of the problems whenever a language becomes a subject. That's one of the reasons why motivations is often cited as an issue in Japan, is because English is more a subject for a lot of kids and not so much a living language.
Yeah.
But my image of if you start teaching a language to primary school kids, it's got to be quite fun and upbeat, otherwise they're going to tear the walls down. So I think it must be a positive thing to start teaching from an early age.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see whether this does lead to any changes, because the UK does have quite an abysmal record in terms of foreign language
And it's
teaching.
quite a monolingual culture, from the kind of my experience of it. I never got fluent in another language living in England. None of my family speak other languages.
Yeah, I think that's a very common experience. Yeah, so hopefully it's going to make some changes to how things are done in the UK. But anyway, that's today's TEFL News section.
Thank you very much for listening to this week's episode. We hope you enjoyed it. You can now contact us via Twitter. You can follow us at TEFLology. We also have a Gmail address, teflology@gmail.com. Okay, so we hope you tune in again next time.
So it's goodbye from me.
It's goodbye from me.
Goodbye from me.
Goodbye.